Picture this. It's roughly 430,000 years ago in a place now called Cima de los Huesos, deep in the mountains of northern Spain, at the bottom of a vertical shaft that drops more than 40 feet into pitch darkness. And down there, mixed in with the bones of at least 28 other individuals, is a skull with two nearly identical fractures punched into the forehead, right above the left eye, close together, the same size, the same shape, struck from roughly the same angle. Not one impact, two, in almost the exact same spot. Researchers who studied this skull ran the kind of analysis you'd expect from a modern forensic team investigating a contemporary crime scene, and the conclusion they reached was about as close to a smoking gun as 400,000 years of decomposition allows. This wasn't an accidental fall. This wasn't an animal attack. This was almost certainly the oldest solid case of deliberate, repeated, intentional human-on-human violence we have ever found, and yes, that almost certainly means murder. So let's ask the obvious, slightly unsettling question this video exists to answer. What actually happened after that? Not the killing itself, but the aftermath. Did ancient humans have any concept of justice? Did the group hunt down whoever did this? Was there punishment, banishment, some ancient version of a trial? Or did everyone just sort of shrug, toss the body down a hole, and move on with their day? Because that's apparently just how things worked back then. Stick around, because how ancient humans handled the very first murders tells us something genuinely fascinating about where our entire modern sense of justice, fairness, and right versus wrong actually came from. And the answer is a lot more complicated and a lot more human than you'd expect from a story this old. Let's start by addressing something important right away, because it changes how we should think about this entire topic. Murder, in the sense of one human deliberately killing another human within their own social group, almost certainly wasn't some shocking, unprecedented first that happened exactly once in some neat, dateable moment. It was almost certainly happening in various forms across enormous stretches of ancient human and even pre-human history, well before anyone thought to bury a body carefully or leave behind evidence clear enough for modern researchers to identify it confidently as deliberate killing rather than accident or animal predation. The first murder isn't really a single event we can point to. It's more accurate to say we're looking at the first murder we happen to have clear enough evidence for, sitting at the very edge of a much longer, much murkier history of human violence that almost certainly stretches back even further than what the physical evidence can currently prove. That said, the Cima de los Huesos case gives us an incredible, genuinely rare window into thinking seriously about this question. So let's dig into it properly. The individual with the fractured skull was found at the bottom of a deep, vertical shaft, alongside dozens of other skeletons accumulated over what was likely a long period of time. Researchers have debated extensively why so many bodies ended up down there. One leading theory suggests the shaft functioned as something resembling a deliberate disposal site, possibly even something resembling an early funerary practice, where bodies were intentionally placed or dropped into this specific location rather than simply abandoned wherever death happened to occur. If that's accurate, it means whoever was responsible for putting that fractured skull down there wasn't necessarily hiding evidence of a crime in some calculated, guilty cover-up. They might have simply been following an existing group practice for handling the dead, regardless of how that particular individual happened to die. And that detail matters enormously for the question we're actually asking, because it suggests something genuinely interesting. Even if this was murder, the body wasn't necessarily treated with disrespect or discarded carelessly afterward. It may have received roughly the same treatment as anyone else in the group who died from completely natural causes, which raises an uncomfortable but important possibility worth sitting with. Maybe this wasn't treated as a unique, scandalous, group-shattering event requiring some dramatic social response at all. Maybe, to whatever group this person belonged to, a violent death was simply death, handled through whatever existing practices the group already had in place, without necessarily triggering some separate, specialized system of justice we'd recognize today. Now, before you assume ancient humans were just casually indifferent to violence within their own groups, let's complicate that picture significantly, because the actual evidence across the broader ancient human record paints a much more nuanced and, frankly, more reassuring picture than that. Skeletal evidence from multiple ancient sites across different time periods and regions shows clear signs of interpersonal violence, healed defensive wounds, perifractures on forearms consistent with someone raising an arm to block an incoming blow, skull trauma inconsistent with accidents, and embedded projectile points in bone that clearly came from another human, rather than a hunting accident gone wrong. This evidence tells us violence within and between ancient human groups was real, documented, and not particularly rare across deep history. But here's here's the genuinely important part. Alongside that evidence of violence, we also consistently find evidence of healed injuries, meaning plenty of ancient humans survived violent encounters and were cared for afterward, which tells us groups weren't simply indifferent to harm happening among their own members. Someone tended to those wounds. Someone helped a violently injured person survive long enough for those fractures to heal. That's not the behavior of a species with zero concept of right and wrong regarding violence against each other. Let's talk about why group living itself almost certainly forced some kind of early informal system for handling violence and wrongdoing, even without anything resembling formal courts, written laws, or designated judges. Remember everything we've covered in earlier videos about how dependent ancient humans were on cooperation for basic survival. A small group completely reliant on shared food, shared protection, shared childcare, and constant close cooperation simply cannot function if violence within that group goes completely unaddressed and unmanaged. Unchecked violence threatens the entire group's stability, not just the immediate victim. If someone could kill another group member with zero consequence whatsoever, that creates a level of internal danger and distrust that would make sustained cooperative living genuinely impossible over time. Groups that had zero mechanism whatsoever for managing internal violence would have been at a serious survival disadvantage compared to groups that developed even crude, informal methods for handling it, which means some kind of response to violence, even if it looked nothing like a modern courtroom, was almost certainly a practical evolutionary necessity, not an optional cultural nicety some groups happened to invent for fun. So what did that early informal system of accountability likely look like in practice? This is where anthropological research into small-scale societies, which again gives us a living comparative window into dynamics that likely existed deep in ancient human history, becomes genuinely useful. Researchers studying conflict resolution in hunter-gatherer and other small-scale societies have documented a range of responses to serious violence, including killing within the group that almost certainly echo much older patterns. These responses typically didn't resemble formal trials with evidence presented and a verdict delivered by a neutral judge. They more often resembled negotiated, socially mediated processes involving the entire group, or at least its respected, influential members, working through what happened, why it happened, and what should be done about it collectively. One documented pattern involves something researchers call restitution or compensation, where the person responsible for a killing, or that person's close family and relatives, is expected to provide some form of payment, material goods, labor, or social obligation directly to the victim's family or wider group as a way of restoring social balance after a serious wrong. This isn't about punishment in the way modern justice systems typically frame it. It's about repair, about acknowledging the damage done and finding some concrete way to address it that allows the group to continue functioning together afterward. Since exile or execution of every single person responsible for violence would have been an unsustainable response in a small group that genuinely couldn't afford to keep losing members. Speaking of which, let's talk about exile and ostracism again, because we touched on this in an earlier video about laziness, but it applies with significantly more weight and urgency to violence, especially killing. Banishment from the group was almost certainly one of the most severe, most commonly available responses ancient groups had to genuinely serious wrongdoing, because, as we've discussed extensively, survival alone in a hostile ancient landscape was an absolutely brutal proposition. Casting someone out of the group for committing murder wasn't necessarily framed explicitly as justice in the abstract, moral sense we'd use that word today. It was a direct, practical removal of a dangerous, destabilizing element from a tightly interdependent social structure that simply couldn't afford to keep absorbing that kind of risk. Whether the person being exiled framed it internally as punishment, or simply as the group no longer trusts me enough to keep me around, the practical outcome was the same: removal from the protective, cooperative structure that ancient survival depended on almost entirely. And then there's the more direct, more uncomfortable response: retaliatory killing. Documented patterns in various small-scale societies show that killings, particularly ones perceived as unjustified or especially brutal, could trigger direct retaliation from the victim's family or close allies, sometimes escalating into cycles of violence that researchers studying conflict in small-scale societies have specifically tracked and documented as a genuine, persistent risk in these social structures. This is, frankly, the much darker side of how ancient humans likely handled serious violence, because revenge killing doesn't actually resolve the underlying problem of internal group violence. It just spreads it, potentially turning a single act of violence into an ongoing feud that could destabilize an entire group or even draw in neighboring groups over multiple generations. Some anthropologists have specifically argued that one of the major functions formal justice systems eventually served, once humans developed agriculture, settled communities, and more complex social structures, was specifically to interrupt and replace exactly this kind of dangerous, self-perpetuating cycle of retaliatory violence that informal ancient justice systems struggled to fully contain. This brings up a genuinely fascinating question worth sitting with directly. Were ancient humans actually capable of distinguishing between different types of killing, the way modern legal systems distinguish between, say, murder, manslaughter, and justified self-defense? There's good reason to think the answer is yes, at least in some meaningful, functional sense. Comparative research into small-scale societies consistently shows that context mattered enormously in how violence was judged and responded to. A killing committed in clear self-defense was typically treated very differently from a killing that appeared premeditated, unprovoked, or particularly brutal. A killing during an emotionally charged sudden conflict was often viewed differently from a calculated, planned attack. This suggests ancient humans, even without any formal legal vocabulary for these distinctions, were almost certainly already operating with some intuitive moral framework that separated "this was understandable, even if regrettable" from "this crossed a line that demands a serious response." That's a remarkably sophisticated moral capacity to have been working with, completely informally hundreds of thousands of years before anyone wrote down a single law. Let's talk about something genuinely important here regarding motive, because the Cima de los Huesos case specifically raises an interesting question that researchers have actually speculated about directly. Why would someone deep in ancient human history deliberately strike another person's skull twice in nearly the same spot? Researchers studying the case have suggested this pattern looks less like an act of impulsive, chaotic rage, and more like a deliberate, controlled, almost methodical act, which raises uncomfortable but genuinely important questions about premeditation existing this early in our evolutionary history. If that interpretation holds up, it suggests that planned, intentional violence against a specific individual, the kind of thing modern legal systems would unambiguously classify as murder rather than manslaughter, existed far earlier in human history than most people would assume, alongside whatever early moral framework groups were already using to process and respond to it. Now let's pull back and talk about something that connects directly to earlier videos in this series, because it's relevant here too: gossip and reputation. We've already established that gossip functioned as an incredibly powerful, informal policing mechanism for things like laziness and freeloading. It almost certainly functioned with even greater intensity and consequence regarding violence and killing. A person responsible for an unjustified, brutal, or unprovoked killing within their group would have faced an absolutely devastating reputational collapse, the kind that, as we've discussed, directly threatened survival in a small, interdependent group. Even without any formal trial or designated authority figure handing down judgment, the accumulated social weight of an entire group viewing someone as dangerous, untrustworthy, and a threat to collective safety would have applied enormous pressure, potentially building toward exile, retaliation, or at minimum, a permanently damaged position within the group that affected every single future interaction, every food-sharing decision, every choice about who gets included in the next hunting party or the next migration. Let's also consider the role that elders, leaders, or particularly respected individuals likely played in mediating these situations, because most documented small-scale societies don't leave conflict resolution entirely to chaotic, undirected group consensus. Respected figures, often older individuals with accumulated social standing, extensive experience, and broad trust across the group, frequently played a direct mediating role in serious disputes, helping negotiate outcomes, propose compensation, or make the case for exile or forgiveness depending on the specific circumstances involved. This almost certainly extended deep into ancient human history as well. Even in groups without any formal leadership hierarchy in the way we typically imagine it, certain individuals likely held outsized influence over how serious conflicts got resolved, based purely on accumulated trust and respect rather than any official title or institutional authority. Here's something genuinely worth considering. Maybe the most important function these early informal justice responses served wasn't really about the specific individual who committed violence at all. Maybe it was primarily about reassuring everyone else in the group that violence within their own ranks wouldn't simply go unaddressed, that there were real, predictable consequences for seriously harming another group member, and that the group's overall safety and cooperative structure remained intact and protected despite what had happened. In that sense, ancient responses to murder may have functioned less like punishment aimed purely at the perpetrator and more like a stabilizing signal aimed at the entire surviving group, a way of saying, collectively, yes, something terrible happened, but the system that keeps all of us safe together is still functioning, and we are addressing this. Let's also touch on something genuinely unsettling that's worth being honest about. Not every act of serious violence within an ancient group necessarily received a clear, consistent response at all. Power dynamics almost certainly mattered enormously here, exactly as they tragically still do today. A particularly strong, influential, or well-connected individual responsible for violence may have faced significantly less serious consequences than someone with weaker social standing or fewer allies within the group. There's no reason to assume ancient justice, informal as it was, operated with perfect, consistent fairness across every single case. Some killers almost certainly got away with it entirely, protected by status, family connections, or simple intimidation, while others, particularly those already on shaky social ground before the violence occurred, likely faced much harsher, swifter consequences for comparable acts. This uncomfortable pattern, where social standing significantly influences how seriously wrongdoing actually gets addressed, isn't some modern corruption layered on top of an imagined, purer ancient system. It appears to be a remarkably old, remarkably persistent feature of how human social justice has actually functioned across an enormous stretch of our history, informal and formal alike. Now let's circle back to the question of fear and deterrence, because this matters enormously for understanding why any system of accountability for violence developed at all, beyond pure abstract moral reasoning. Ancient humans living in small, tightly interdependent groups had every practical reason to want clear, visible deterrence against violence within their own ranks, completely separate from any philosophical concept of justice as an abstract moral good. If killing a fellow group member carried real, predictable, serious consequences, whether exile, retaliation, compensation demands, or permanent reputational collapse, that consequence structure itself functioned as a practical deterrent, reducing the likelihood of future violence by making the personal cost of committing it clearly, visibly higher than whatever benefit the perpetrator might have hoped to gain. This deterrent function likely mattered just as much, probably more, than any abstract sense of fairness or moral balance the group might have also been pursuing simultaneously. Let's bring this back to Cima de los Huesos one more time, because there's a detail worth sitting with that we haven't fully addressed yet. We will never know exactly what happened after that skull was fractured twice in the same spot. We don't know if the group exiled whoever did it. We don't know if there was retaliation, negotiation, compensation, or simple, quiet silence. We don't know if the killer was a respected member of the group who faced minimal consequence, or someone already on thin social ice who paid an enormous price for it. The bones can tell us, with remarkable forensic precision, that violence happened. They cannot tell us what the group decided to do about it afterward, and that gap, frustrating as it is exactly where the genuinely fascinating uncertainty of this entire topic lives. What we can say with real confidence, built on the broader pattern of evidence across hundreds of thousands of years of ancient human history, is that violence within groups almost certainly didn't go completely unaddressed as some kind of casual, accepted background feature of daily life. The cooperative structures that allowed ancient humans to survive at all simply couldn't have tolerated truly unchecked internal violence without collapsing entirely. Some system, however informal, however inconsistently applied, however far short of modern ideals of fairness it likely fell, almost certainly existed to manage, respond to, and deter serious violence within the group, because the alternative, a complete absence of any consequence or accountability whatsoever, would have made sustained group cooperation essentially impossible to maintain. And maybe that's genuinely the most important takeaway buried in all of this. Our entire modern apparatus of courts, laws, trials, and formal justice didn't appear out of nowhere alongside written language and settled civilization. It grew directly out of something much older, much rougher, and much more informal. Small groups of ancient humans faced with the genuine horror of violence within their own ranks, working out through trial, error, negotiation, and an enormous amount of difficult social pressure. Some way of saying that this mattered, that it couldn't simply be ignored, and that the group's safety and cohesion depended on responding to it seriously. The specific methods were almost certainly messy, inconsistent, and occasionally deeply unfair, shaped by power and status in ways that should feel uncomfortably familiar. But the underlying impulse, the basic insistence that serious harm to another person within your own community demands some kind of response, appears to be remarkably old, stretching back hundreds of thousands of years before anyone ever wrote down a single law.